me and allowing me to actually talk about something that at least I am really excited about, because I actually think it's pretty cool. And hopefully y'all are not bored to tears as I'm talking about the Pink 2 Black Gayness and TV comedy. And so I want to sort of also do a plug. On one hand, I love my book cover, so I like to actually show it anytime I can. But I also, of course, want to do a plug for my book that is out in April of 2021 that does cover some of what I'm talking about today in, as Summer said, in much greater detail. So I want to sort of start here in some ways with a somewhat incomplete look at Black gayness as it has appeared in television comedy in particular. So I want to sort of draw us to the top middle, a gentleman, or a character rather, named Travis, who appeared in 1977 on a Black cast sitcom called Sanford Arms, which was a spinoff of Sanford and Son. And so we also, in this image, have from the gentleman from Noah's Ark, a series that was on Logo, that was the first and to date the only series to feature a primary cast of Black gay characters. Underneath him is Cedric, who is a character named Cedric, that is, who is on the series Are We There Yet? Underneath that is, and I should remember these characters' names, but he's on Let's Stay Together, and his name is something that is escaping me. And then we sort of move into what I call either white cast or multicultural cast sitcoms with Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Don't Trust the Bee in Apartment 23, Sirens, and Curses if I can't, no, I almost said the one that Neil Patrick Harris was on, and I've completely forgotten the name, and which makes me a bad broadcast historian, but that's all right. And then the one at the top is, and I saved that one for last, is Omar from the series Moesha, which we will talk about in some greater detail today. So on one hand, when we talk about television comedy, and in particular, I'm talking about sort of scripted comedy because if I was talking about sort of a broader landscape of comedy, I might also have added in Antoine and Blaine from In Living Color's Men On sketches, as well as Eddie Murphy's portrayal of Dion from Saturday Night Live, the years when he was on there. But I'm specifically actually looking at television narrative comedy versus necessarily sketch comedy. And so that in some ways, this broadly construed is the universe that I want to talk about and sort of the differences that I want to talk about today. So I start by sort of going to 2008, and this is an image from CBS News, obviously. A columnist, Richard Kim, who says, other numbers paint an even grimmer picture. If exit polls are to be believed, some 70% of African Americans voted yes on Proposition 8 in California. Proposition 8, of course, was the proposition that was to deny the right to marriage for LGBT couples in California. And this is also simultaneously the period in which, or the time period / election in which Obama is elected president. So part of the kind of discursive argument that happened was that Black folks overwhelmingly supported Barack Obama for president in California, but at the same time, 70% allegedly of Black folks also voted yes on Proposition 8 to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman. And so part of the reason that I like to start with this is because the numbers actually shook out where it was roughly 54% which is about in line with the percentage of Latinos and the percentage of Asian / Asian American folk. And what it actually points to, in some ways, is the way that this kind of discourse about Blackness and its connection to anti-gayness gets picked up and gets understood as a truth that sort of helps us to explain or understand how the world broadly functions. And so it is very easy for us to believe, because we already believe that Black folks are anti-gay. It's easy for us to believe that 70% of African Americans voted to define marriage as the institution between a man and a woman. And so what I use that Proposition 8 and Obama's election to do is set up this kind of discursive formation of Black audiences or Black people, which extends to Black audiences, as always already anti-gay. And so I start and sort of use as ground zero basically the 1990s. What happens in the 1990s is, on one hand, 1995, Jess Cagle of Entertainment Weekly calls the 90s the gay 90s, because there is an explosion of gay content, as well as gay folks within music and popular culture. So we have, folks like Katie Lang, folks like Melissa Etheridge, folks like Michael Stipe from REM coming out as gay. In addition, we have gay representation happening on television in series like Roseanne. And although this cover is from before 1997 and 1998, later in the decade, we actually have in 96, the beginning of Spin City, which features a Black gay character, Carter Haywood. 1997, Ellen Morgan, the character that Ellen DeGeneres is playing on the sitcom Ellen, comes out as gay and also comes out as lesbian in real life. And then in 1998, Will and Grace debuts. And so on one hand, I'm sort of looking at and thinking through this explosion of gay representation and just general gayness in the 1990s. On the other hand, I'm sort of asking, the 1990s saw this explosion of Black cast content as well. So by 1993, the Fox network was debuting, or programming rather, the largest number of Black cast sitcoms that there has ever been on television. So the question in some ways is, if there's this bunch of Black gay content, Black content and this bunch of gay content, how come Black gay content was not the thing to sort of come out of that? And so sort of part of that is, why has Black gayness not been afforded a sort of post-gay status within television and within television comedy? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about it within this structure of the generic closet, which I understand as the 3-act structure. So I very much am drawing on some of the sort of classic 3-act structure narrative work that people like Linda Seeger have done. And so essentially what the generic closet does, as I have theorized it, is it works as a narrative structure for scripts that ensures that Black gayness never actually has an ongoing presence within the Black cast sitcom. So Act 1 is the detection stage. So that is generally when something is not quite right. And so there's this idea that something is off. So perhaps this character dresses a little bit differently, perhaps like speaks differently, comes from a different kind of neighborhood. There's something that is understood as off. And the offness in that first act is the thing that in some ways set these narrative wheels in motion. Act 2 is the discovery and declaration. So on one hand, it's about discovering that the thing we thought was off is really that this character is gay. And then the declaration needs to happen, which is generally a speech act in which someone says, I'm gay, or, are asked specifically if they are gay. And importantly, and so detection, discovery, and declaration as Act 1 and 2 are fairly standardized in some ways within sitcoms and television comedy broadly. It's actually the Act 3 that is important here, which is the discarding. So because Black Gayness is positioned within these television comedies, is really about sort of discovering this problem, and gayness is understood as a narrative problem. Once the narrative problem has been solved, then these characters get discarded. And part of that, and part of the why, is what I'm going to talk about today as I walk through a number of slides. So I, based on my own sort of research orientation, I am not interested in necessarily reading these sitcoms for their narrative content necessarily, although I am very much interested in the 3-act structure. Instead, what I'm very much interested in is looking at what's called the circuit of media study, and certainly looking at the text itself, but also placing these things within their sociocultural and industrial context, thinking about their production and production practices. So for Moesha, which I'm going to talk about today, I specifically talked to the writer of the Labels episode, as well as the series showrunner / executive producer. I think through reception, with 20 interviews with Black gay men about these representations. And then I also think about post-production, which is, in my case, thinking through the use of the laugh track and humor, and sort of the way that then these things all come together to not only shape how this representation plays itself out, but how it constructs and reconstructs the generic closet for Black gayness. So if I can sort of step back a bit and talk about broadcast history in the 90s, Fox debuts in 86. And as I mentioned, by 93, they're airing the largest crop of Black produced shows in TV history. And they do so by narrow casting. So Fox is initially interested in focusing on young adult males and urban audiences, because in the early 1990s, hip hop has really sort of come to the fore, and folks are really, particularly white suburban teens and young adult men, are really here for hip hop. And so, so part of what happens in the early 1990s is that television, in particular on Fox, we start to see a kind of hip hop turn in television. So in addition to seeing folks like LL Cool J and Queen Latifah having their own series on Fox, we also start to see like theme songs that are sung / performed / rapped by hip hop artists. So for instance, one of Fox's first big hits, In Living Color, was the theme song was rapped by Heavy D of Heavy D and the Boys. So UPN and the WB debut in 1995, and in some ways take a page from Fox as Fox starts to divest from producing Black cast content, because Fox actually gets the rights to Sunday Night Football, so they end up shifting their sort of audience profile to more fit in line with and chase that sort of big football money. So when UPN debuts, Moesha is one of the shows that is their first big hit. And so initially, Moesha is a project that is greenlit at CBS. And it is essentially to capture a younger demo, because even today, we think about CBS as being a sort of older skewing network. And so Moesha was an attempt in some ways to capture a younger demographic for CBS. And importantly, Moesha was casting contingent. And what casting contingency means is that the show would not have ever made it to the air unless the network approved who was the axial character. What proved really important, according to Ralph Farquhar, the series showrunner / executive producer, is that as he was taking the meeting with CBS, they initially did not know who Brandy was. And when she appeared on the cover of 17 magazine as not only an African-American teenager, but an African-American teenager with braids in her hair, and not particularly light-skinned, although she's not necessarily dark-skinned, but not, a light-skinned Black woman, it sort of proved to the executives at CBS that Moesha could work with Brandy as the axial character, because she was certainly Black and had a Black following through her music, but 17 magazine demonstrated that she also had crossover appeal. What Ralph Farquhar wanted to do with Moesha was create what he calls a more genuine Black family after the Cosby Show. So part of the criticism that comes from the Cosby Show is this idea that the characters on the Cosby Show are not necessarily genuine and or authentically Black, whatever that means. And so Moesha debuts on UPN in 1996. CBS passes on the series because essentially they can't find a place for it on their network. So the concept of flow works here. So usually programs are aired with something that is very similar in tone, so that presumably for an hour you can, or at least an hour, you can lock in a particular viewer for that amount of time. But ABC passes. Ralph Farquhar starts taking meetings with ABC and UPN. ABC says, yes, we want this. We will give you a 6-episode order. We have some notes and some creative concerns. UPN said, here's 13 episodes. We don't have any concerns. So go on and make the show. So they decided to go with UPN. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we have the Gay 90s dubbed by Jess Cagle in 95. And there's also in the 90s this demographic shift that is happening where the slumpy audience becomes really important. Slumpy stands for socially liberal, upwardly mobile, or urban-minded, depending on where Ron Becker has defined it. But it's socially liberal, upwardly mobile, professional audience. And so these are generally white audiences, 18 to 34 with expendable income. And so this becomes the demographic community that networks on one hand become really interested in, but it becomes the network target for this kind of gay 90s programming. So to sort of, put a fine point on it, this is not an imagination of a Black audience. This is an imagination of a white audience. And so when we talk then about authorship and sort of how this episode of Moesha comes to the fore, Demetrius Beatty writes this Moesha episode called Labels, which apparently now anybody can see because it's now on Netflix, which is a whole thing, but we can talk about that in Q&A. So this episode is basically concerns, Moesha has broken up with her long-term boyfriend, and she meets her neighbor's cousin, who they knew as children. And they decide that they are going to go out on a date. And during the date, Moesha and Omar meet another gentleman named Tracy. And Tracy is what can best be described as sort of flamboyantly gay, or perhaps obviously gay. And whereas Omar has had a little something that was supposed to raise our ire, but we could never necessarily put our finger on the fact that it was that he was gay. So what happens is that we work with this gay by association sort of context wherein because Moesha has seen Omar and Tracy interact, she begins to sort of tell her friends that she thinks Omar might be gay. So Demetrius Beatty writes this episode. At the time, he's a freelance writer and has the autonomy to go ahead and go off and write this episode because as a freelance writer, he can write whatever he wants. They're under no obligation to utilize it. But he says that there were some writer's room issues. On one hand, these folks in the writer's room, including Ralph Farquhar, the executive producer, say that they tell them that they like the episode a lot. But then he goes home, or everybody goes home that night, and Ralph Farquhar writes a new scene into his script, which is a script that introduces this flamboyantly gay character that sets this narrative chain in motion that Omar might be gay. And so when this episode and when these kinds of concerns come up, Demetrius Beatty, as a Black gay man, although he was closeted at the time, or at least not out, he was not necessarily closeted, he was not out. He is sort of fighting in the writer's room to not have this flamboyantly gay character in his script because he is interested in the burden of representation that Black gays have to bear. So at this point in television history, there has only been Travis on Sanford Arms in terms of shows that are specifically for Black cast audiences. There's Travis on Sanford Arms. There's Dion on SNL, played by Eddie Murphy. There's Antoine and Blaine Edwards and Antoine Merriweather on In Living Color. And then prior to this, we had actually seen a character on the series Rock that was played by Richard Roundtree, also known as the original Shaft. But generally speaking, like there have not been a lot of Black gay characters. So for Demetrius Beatty, he is very much interested in trying to understand this burden of representation and saying in some ways that Black gayness has always been mediated in these in these ways associated with femininity. And so he wants to try to break that up. And so he fights and he says, and Ralph Farquhar corroborates the story, he says he fights this almost up to the point of losing his job because he is so very interested in not having this character in here. And let's also sort of be clear here, he could have actually lost his job, but the series still could have actually run this episode with his name on it, even if he was fired. So Ralph Farquhar says that this flamboyant character we know is sort of bad on his own, but because we actually had Tracy, who was sort of the character that would balance that, so in some ways you had the good and the bad in the same space, he thought it would be okay. But he's also sort of thinking about the confines of the 30-minute series that requires, as he says, driving the point home. So within the 30-minute episode, and because they were trying to deal with gayness within 30 minutes, there can be no narrative ambiguity. So when we then talk about this episode in which Omar has to come out as sort of, in some ways, the price of the ticket for his representation, coming out then becomes an organizing logic of televisual gayness. And so this homosexuality then, or queerness, gets framed within these ideas and ideals around heteronormativity or sort of the normalcy of heterosexuality. And so, so what then are the queer politics of the Black cast sitcoms? So the politics of televisibility is really that these characters can't come back in some ways. And why don't they come back? On one hand, it's ideological. So, it is about this idea that they don't actually want to inflect their series with too much queerness for fear that the audiences will soften for the audience. I'm sorry, for the series. I'm thinking that it is thus a gay show. In the other way, it's also industrial in the sense that each heterosexual writer or showrunner that I talk to, and Beatty is the only queer person I talk to in terms of television production, each one of them, in one way or another, said they couldn't think of other stories for Black gay characters. So coming out becomes the only way that Black gayness is imagined. They could not necessarily imagine, this Black gay dude showing up and just like, eating at the table with Moesha or what have you. It is that there is always this performative act of coming out, and that is the beginning and end of the narrative. And so the other piece of it is, and this is a quote from Ed Weinberger. He says, here's the problem. The only people right now doing Black cast TV shows are TV1 and BET. I also, let me sort of circle here that I talked to him in 2014, so this is slightly changed. But there are Black executives running those networks. I don't think they have encouraged gay Black characters because they're fearful of alienating their audience. I think they're afraid that there's still a prejudice. TV1 did 2 gay characters on Love That Girl, but they weren't Black, they were Hispanic. They could be allowed to be a stereotypical without alienating the Black audience. I have a feeling that if they tried to make those characters Black, they would have not been able to get on the air. Demetrius Beatty similarly says, for Black shows, they couldn't imagine a situation in which a character could sustain a series like Will and Grace. It hasn't changed much since writing labels for Moesha. I went to a pitch over at BET. A gay person at the network told me I shouldn't write any gay characters. That was their directive because they didn't think their audience would ever accept a recurring gay character, which I think is just ridiculous, or ludicrous rather. So what we are left with then are these sort of stereotypes of whiteness and white audiences. So what I sort of, the acronym that I've come up with is WELL, so that they're wealthy, they're educated, they're logical, and they're liberal. And so this is generally the way that we think of white people. And so when we think about them as cardboard cutouts, as these sort of figures that are imagined in our brain, these stereotypes really structure the imagination of programs, or audiences rather, and then those imaginations of audience structure what kinds of TV programs get greenlit. So when we talk about stereotypes of Blackness, that's actually Burke. So on one hand, Black audiences are supposed to be bigoted, uneducated, religious, and often overly so, and poor or poorer. And so these then become the ways that Blackness is understood. And so it shapes the way that the programming would thus structure itself. And so what I say is we're missing the Blampy demographic in the imagination, the Black liberal, affluent, metropolitan professional audience. That audience is missing in the demographic imagination. And so what happens is that the closet becomes this thing that traps these characters into these single episode arcs, or perhaps sometimes it takes several episodes, but usually it's one and done. And so in production, they say the gay story can only be about coming out, and they're beholden to viewership, not necessarily the politics within the writer's room. So what I want to sort of be really clear about is that I don't believe that anyone who works in the production on these series that I talk about in the book, or in Hollywood writ large, I don't believe that those folks are necessarily anti-gay. I believe that television, and Black television in particular, is so precarious that they are beholden to this idea of making viewership as stable as possible, because Fox picked up and dropped Black audiences, UPN picked up and dropped Black audiences, as did the WB, as did UPN, as did TBS, and the list goes on. And so, you know, for the showrunners, the script goes through the writer's room, the production studio, and the network. And Farquhar is like, nobody wants to offend anybody because he wants to focus on running the show, not responding to like viewer hate mail or anything like that. And so the queer politics of the generic closet are the way that the Black Cast sitcom imagines, on one hand, a monolithic Black audience. It contains Black gayness into specific coming out episodes, and it discards these stories in lieu of other mainstream stories. And so ultimately, what the generic closet does is it brings gayness into these series for an episode or so. And what they ultimately want to do is demonstrate how very cool the core cast is, because like they were hanging out with a gay dude for 30 minutes. And then after that gay dude is gone, because no one ever actually says anything homophobic, of course. And so after that 30 minutes is gone, what we're left is in some ways their residual coolness, even if we don't actually have the gay character anymore. And so I'm going to leave it there, and we can talk through some other stuff in the Q&A.